Good hello once again, and welcome to another episode / video, whatever, of this Utopian project thing that I'm doing. I am LC Lupus, and today we're going to be looking at industry and exports. So, in case you haven't watched the other / listened to the other videos, it would probably be a good idea to do so because it does go into everything. And this one especially really doesn't really make sense unless you understand the more communal aspect. I also don't think this one will be a particularly long video, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think I have as much to say here as I did in some of the other videos, so yeah. Anyway, so as I've explored before, we want to try and organize a more utopian society around a more, around a more communal nature, right? We want people to be living more in small communities rather than in large cities and what have you, because it's just, those places aren't really great for us overall. So let's rather not, Anyway, so basically that is the main thing here that we want to essentially try to separate from the way that we've kind of done things before. We want to separate from the way that things have been done in the past to hopefully do it better, to not focus as much on a more global supply chain. Because at the moment, most of the things that you consume, most of the goods and the foods or what have you, are brought from all over the world. They're brought all around, and that really isn't great for many people. It's not great for the environment. It's not great for regular people. It's really not just. It's just not great. In general, it's not a good thing. Now, as we've spoken about in sort of previous videos, in the more agricultural video, let me actually see which video that was. That was the third video, Agriculture, Environmentalism, and Animals. We kind of want most places, or pretty much every place, to grow their own stuff, right? To have their own systems in place for the majority of everything. However, there are things that are very, very specialized items or foods that might, like I say, foods that can't really be grown in certain climates, so we want to rather grow it in different climates, etc., etc. And also just sort of things. So, you can't exactly build an entire laptop in one place. So the idea of maintaining some level of industry in which various places have some kind of a speciality is, I think, a good idea. It still allows for international trade, but it's not international trade of a pretty intense level that we currently have now. So say different towns all have some kind of an international export that they produce, something that they can ship around the world to somewhere, something that just they make, or not necessarily just them, but they're one of the places that makes this thing, whatever this thing is. Because at the moment, international networks make use of a couple of things which aren't so great. So first off, a lot of cargo ships, a lot of planes, a lot of trucks. All of those are, environmentally catastrophic. It would be much better if we use rail. Rail is pretty much like the best thing that we've really got for combating climate change in terms of transportation of goods and what have you. So if we're not so focused on getting things as quickly as possible, then we can instead focus much more so on having some kind of a system in place that can actually help people and can actually work without destroying the environment. So we want to rather focus on some kind of a rail system for larger kind of international trips. Now, there isn't really anything that it makes it special that there should be something that you get from another country across the ocean. That doesn't really seem to be much of a necessity necessarily for that. There are certain goods, I suppose, that can only be grown in certain places, but those kind of things, like, do you really need that special kind of fruit that only grows in South America, so you need it flown all the way here? Like, that's not really necessary for you. I'm sure you might like it, but, just because you want something doesn't necessarily mean that you should have a thing. Now, obviously, some people would say, oh, well, this reduces your sort of consumerist choices. Well, I've spoken about consumerism before and how it's not really a good thing. And most of the time, say, foods and such can be grown locally and there's not really a need for it. So certain things, if they're made around the world, so say you need to make chips. And when I say chips, I don't mean the things you eat. I mean chips as in computer chips. Say there'll be a place, there'll be a town that makes computer chips, there'll be a town that makes screens, there'll be a town that makes blah, blah, blah. So each of these towns make these things, and they ship them around. Now, it doesn't have to be, because at the moment, this is all kind of localized in Asia, mostly China, where these things are then shipped all around the world. And that's because they have, poor, labor controls. So you can do it very, very cheaply there. Now, in this kind of society, that would not be necessary. You wouldn't have to have that. So say you could have a factory in every sort of region, and then that factory can supply that region with that thing. Because there's no profit motive, right? So most things don't actually need to be shipped internationally. It's unnecessary. And also we now know techniques for doing things like growing things that shouldn't be grown here necessarily. For instance, I live in South Africa, and very close to me, I mean like a 5-minute drive, there is a dragon fruit farm. Dragon fruit are not from here, yet we're able to grow dragon fruit. There's a lot of things we could just grow other places. We don't need to necessarily ship it from all over the world. It's not necessary to do that. It just isn't, So we want to rather try and do this. Now, I've spoken about this idea of also anti-obsolescence. The way we currently have things is your phone breaks really, really quickly. And so that's why you have to get a new one every, Now, you're taught that you need to get like a new phone every year or two. You can have a phone for years and years and years. I do. I keep phones until they become so slow that I have to get it. It's not because it breaks. It's just because the apps become updated so much that it's planned obsolescence. These devices slow down over time because why not? I suppose, which is just absolutely great. That's something that we can do. But anyway, so we don't want that. We want things to be made generally locally, and most of the international exports are things that could be made anywhere. Clothes can be made anywhere. It's almost as if before international shipping, clothes were always made locally. Anyway, we can return to a system like that. Most things can be made locally or semi-locally. There are very, very few things that actually need to be internationally shipped. So we want to try and reduce international shipping as much as possible and try to reduce overall the need for any kind of imports, exports as much as possible. Sure, there might be some things that need to go across, so say using things like ships to get across large bodies of water like the oceans. Sure. Now, environmentally, planes are not great, but if we were to massively reduce the number of planes or somehow build a ridiculously long bridge, but that seems like a fantasy solution to getting across large oceans. And also, of course, ships are also massively bad for the environment. But now, the thing is, the reason that ships are so bad for the environment is because, there's so many of them, and there's so many planes. If we just massively reduce the number of import-exports, and also, because most of society is communal, there doesn't need to be lots of travel. Travel should be a thing that's more for personal enjoyment rather than anything else, in which case planes aren't going to be flying. It's not going to be a plane taking off every 10 seconds. There might be a couple planes taking off a day, and it could be there only in certain areas, and otherwise you have to get there by rail. So basically just less of that kind of international transportation, which will just sort of be better for the environment. We don't need to have massive levels of imports and exports and all that kind of stuff. It's not necessary. It's things that we've become used to and that we want, but it isn't actually necessary. It's all based on the cheapest possible way to do things. Colonialism was also partially, colonialism was for many, many reasons, but if you can push things like manufacturing, and if you can push farming into other countries and then just extract those resources, like raw resources, and you can just take them from another country, well, that means you need international shipping lines. And so we needed to do those kind of things, and then we needed to be able to import and export these things that we want, so in terms of, say, they colonize Africa, and so they're like, oh, look, there's all these fruits and stuff you can get in Africa. So we want to, export those from Africa into Europe. So they would do that at the, harm of the local people in those countries. And then also at the same time, colonialism served another function in terms of, yes, it was extracting resources, sure, but what it was also doing was it was opening up markets for European goods. And it was like, oh, look, we're going to make these, these what we consider to be savages. We're going to try to now sell them whatever nonsense that we make that they've never needed, but now we're going to make it seem as if they do need. And that's what you do. You open up these labor markets and you open up these import-export markets because you want to make as much money as possible. And also, of course, cheap labor. When there's no such thing as money, you don't need to offshore your manufacturing. You don't need to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to use China because it's cheap. You don't need to do that because China won't be cheap. Nowhere will be cheap. Everywhere will be the same. So there's no point in trying to scale up your operations as much as possible and build everything around obsolescence. That is not a necessary thing to do. So, yeah, I don't know that much about logistics. This is kind of, I've sort of expended the rest of my knowledge. I don't really know much else, but I hope I've said some things that are in some way interesting. This is by far the shortest video, but I don't want to just keep rambling because I don't necessarily have more information. I don't know more things, but the way it is now, it's just not necessary to have massive import-exports. You can have specializations that are semi-international, and then you can have proper international, which are just very, very uncommon because most things do not need to be international. The only reason we think it has to be international is because that's the current system. We're like, oh yeah, no, we have to buy our clothes from China because that's where we've been buying it because it's cheapest there. Well, when there's no money, it won't be cheapest there. So, yeah. Let's just end there. I hope that this has been in some way interesting or informative or something. But anyway, this has been LC Lupus. You can find me on the social medias at LC_Lupus, where I take pictures of nature and dogs and cats sometimes. Otherwise, you can also check out my book in the description below, The Cyborg Wilderness, which is a piece of eco-fiction about post-apocalypse where a lone cyborg survivor of the end of times war is trying to find some level of hope in an otherwise seemingly hopeless world. I liked it. It's written in a stunted style. There's no commas, there's no apostrophes, there's no quotation marks. It's all very strangely written, on purpose. Maybe you find it interesting, who knows. You can always check it out. Other than that, please do the YouTube things, the like, comment, subscribe, share, because, I need this to be shared so that I can stop being sad. Because I'm very sad. Alright, that was a long enough pause of that. Okay, so otherwise, I hope you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and ta-ta.